Democrats are demanding answers this morning after President Trump broke with long-standing tradition by not notifying top members of Congress about the raid that killed the leader of ISIS. And he suggested that he kept Democrats in the dark because he can't trust them with American lives.
We've notified some. Others are being notified now as I speak. We were going to notify him last night, but we decided not to do that because Washington leaks like I've never seen before. A leak could have cost the death of all of them.
And that wasn't the only moment in his announcement raising questions today. He also gave an extremely detailed narration, details of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's final moments. Joining me now, former CIA operative and former independent presidential candidate Evan McMullin. Back with me, Matt Miller and Brendan Buck. So, Evan, why in the past has it been done differently when there have been top secret military operations? Have many of the operational details been kept secret? And what did you make of what you heard from the president yesterday? Did he cross the line?
I think he crossed the line on sharing operational details, yes. And the reason why we keep those details so close to us and don't reveal them publicly is because they expose how we operate. And especially when these are what we saw against al-Baghdadi, where, U.S. Special Forces doing some of the riskiest types of operational work that they do. And so it's important that we protect the way they go about those operations. We certainly don't want to be sharing details about how they come and go. That was something that the president did. He said that these operators traveled into the site and out of the site through the exact same route. That travel is very dangerous travel, especially when our operators are forced to cover hundreds of miles over what was reported to be a 70-minute journey, where they're taking small arms fire, throughout or at least towards the end. We don't want to share details about that travel with the world because it allows our enemies to plan for counterattacks when we go on these offensives. So, it's important that we protect the way we travel, the way we enter compounds. Some of that is sort of publicly known and assumed. But to have a president confirm it about a very sensitive operation like this puts our men and women at risk.
And Brendan, let me ask you about the notification ahead of the raid. And we heard yesterday the president questioning whether Nancy Pelosi could be trusted with information. Today, just a short time ago, we heard him say Adam Schiff is the biggest leaker in Washington and suggesting that they would leak and it would put American lives at risk. Look, you were in the office, as I understand it, when Speaker Boehner was notified about the death of Osama bin Laden. Can you give us some context for protocol here? Can you imagine Nancy Pelosi leaking information any more than Speaker Boehner would have with U.S. lives at stake?
So I think there's two questions here, and I think we need a little more information. One is whether the Gang of Eight, Speaker Pelosi and others were briefed about the ongoing planning for this operation. We understand that this has been in the works for a number of months. Now, in the lead up to the killing of bin Laden, former Speaker Boehner and others were kept in the loop that they had identified where they believe he was and that they were working towards this operation. That is one thing. The other is whether or not we're talking about getting a phone call after the fact that it had been carried out and that he had, in fact, been killed. Now, congressional leaders in 2011 were informed that he was actually killed, I believe, just a matter of minutes or hours just before President Obama made his remarks. Now, so if it would be highly unusual, I believe, if congressional leaders were not made aware of the planning for this over a period of months. And it's not clear if that's what Nancy Pelosi is talking about. If this is all about whether they got a heads up 20 minutes before the press
conference, I think to the key question here, the key question really is, the president suggested that people who are in a position of power, and I can't think of a less political thing than saying you're going to protect the lives at all costs of American military members. Could you imagine Nancy Pelosi leaking information that could cost American military their lives any more than your old boss would have?
No, of course not. But I think it's important to differentiate between whether or not this is a heads up that the operation had already taken place and the president is about to make remarks to the country versus the long-term planning that's going on and the risks that are being calculated of whether or not to do something like that. And I think we need clarity of whether this is just a heads up, which I think is a relatively small thing after the fact, or whether they were shielded information in the planning stages of this.
You know, a lot of people, Matt, have reminded folks that back in the day, after bin Laden was indeed killed, Donald Trump tweeted this: "Stop congratulating Obama for killing bin Laden. The Navy SEALs killed bin Laden." But look, the president made a tough decision. He made the right decision, but he was quick in that briefing yesterday to take credit. And he even repeated the long discredited claim that he had written about and warned people about bin Laden before anyone else even knew about him. Having said that, is this kind of rhetoric inappropriate or just another example of the difference between, say, President Trump and President Obama after the bin Laden situation?
Well, I think it's both. I think it is very much, he's handled this very much differently than President Obama handled this and how other presidents would have handled it, because he can't help but be inappropriate. Look, this could have been a unifying moment for the country yesterday. This was an opportunity for the president to come out and you know, brief the country on a great military success. And he couldn't do it without, you know, making these baseless claims about Democrats in Congress. He withheld information from them because he thinks they leaked, despite the fact that he apparently briefed Lindsey Graham and Richard Burr, two Republicans, in advance. So he's taken and politicized what should have been an apolitical military operation. He couldn't help but stand up there and make self-aggrandizing and false claims about himself. So, you know, when the president complains about the you know, what he deems as unfair treatment from the press and from his critics, he has no one to blame but himself. He could have handled this like a normal president. He could have tried to rise above the political fray, but he doesn't have that ability because he always has to make everything about himself. He has to try to create a television moment for himself, and he has to baselessly attack his critics. So I think this was I would say, an opportunity lost for the president, except the idea that he would ever have taken that opportunity in the first place, I think is not consistent with the person that we know.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.